jury members for honoring me with such an inspiring award. Like all awards, it's one that I share with my incredibly brave and brilliant colleague, Laura Poitras, who moved to Germany and lived in Berlin for the last 3 years because she feared the steps that her own government would take to try and seize her film and to obtain her source material and spend many, many months in Berlin working with Der Spiegel and other newspapers around the world to get this story out to the public. And it's an award that I share as well with my incredibly brave source, Edward Snowden, who has genuinely inspired millions and millions of people around the world with his noble act of conscience. One of the real benefits of receiving awards that honor people who have used freedom of the press historically is that it gives you an opportunity to understand the value of freedom of the press, not just for ourselves, but how it's been used over the years. And one of the things that strikes me about the Siebenpfeifer example is that it shows that the model of a free press that predominates today is not the only model, and in fact, it's a very recent invention. The idea of freedom of the press was never that it was going to be something practiced by a small, cloistered profession called journalists, who need lots of money in order to do it, and therefore have to work for large corporations, and therefore have to adopt the value that corporations normally have, which is avoiding controversy, avoiding alienating those who are in power, adopting a posture of contrived neutrality and objectivity so as not to upset anybody. This was never how freedom of the press from the beginning was conceived. It was actually quite the opposite. Freedom of the press was intended to be an instrument that all citizens could use, not just a small group of people called journalists, but all citizens could use to work against the interests of those who wield the greatest power, to expose their deceit, to shine a light on that which they were trying to hide, to inform their fellow citizens about what those people in power were intending to do. That was really the way that freedom of the press was first conceived when it was talked about centuries ago. And it was grounded in this Enlightenment idea, this realization about the nature of institutional power and how human beings will exercise that power. And this awareness was grounded in the principle that if we're going to organize a state, a centralized authority, a government, and vest political power in human beings, it is inevitable, not likely, not probable, but inevitable that that power will be abused. Sometimes the power will be abused simply because evil people attain that power. But in far more frequent instances, it will be because ordinary, well-intentioned people acquire that power and succumb to the temptations which as human beings we're all vulnerable to abuse that power. And one alternative would be to say, well, we're simply not going to have a state. We're simply not going to vest political power, and anybody will live in a state of anarchy. But very few people think that's a viable option. And so there's really only one option that's available to us to address that problem. And that is to ensure that there are means that exist to impose limits, to impose checks on what those who wield the greatest power can do. And one of the most important limits that exists in democracy for limiting how power can be abused is a free press. And in order for that to be meaningful, in order for that to function properly, the press cannot be a partner of or a collaborator with those who wield the greatest power. It cannot be devoted to amplifying their message or to promoting their agenda and interests. It has to instead be an adversary to those who wield the greatest power, to be devoted to examining and investigating the claims that it makes to the public, to uncovering exactly that which those who wield the greatest power want to conceal. When I went to Hong Kong with Laura and with Edward Snowden, and we spent 10 or 11 days there together talking about what we were about to do, we spent a great deal of time talking about journalism. In fact, we probably spent more time talking about journalism than we did talking about surveillance. And that's because we knew that this story was going to be a story at least as much about journalism as it was about privacy and spying and all the other topics that have been examined. And one of the things we spent a lot of time talking about was the run-up to the Iraq War, to the invasion and ultimately the destruction of Iraq, which I regard, and I think history will regard, as one of the greatest political crimes of our generation. And what people often think about when they think about that time period in 2002 and 2003 that led up to the Iraq War is the attempt by the US and the British governments and other governments to disseminate falsehoods to the public about the nature of that threat in order to persuade the public to support the invasion. And that obviously and certainly is a major part of the story, but a major part of the story is also the role that media organizations in those countries played in enabling that to happen. Rather than investigate the claims that were being made by those who wield the greatest power, and rather than shining a light on those things which those governments were trying to hide, US media institutions and British media institutions, with very few exceptions, instead embraced those messages and uncritically accepted them as true, and worked as partners with those governments to disseminate those messages and to persuade the public of what the government wanted them to believe. And that was the framework when we were in Hong Kong that together we resolved we were going to avoid in how we did this reporting. We were not going to reveal these documents at the direction of the very governments who had secretly implemented this spying regime. Nor were we going to do the reporting from the perspective of people whose responsibility it is to promote the interests of those governments. We were going to be extremely careful and responsible in what we did, and to this day, the vast majority of the documents that Edward Snowden has taken are documents that we still have not published, largely at his request and because of our responsibility as journalists not to endanger people. But what we did know we were going to do, and what we purposely set out to do, was to make sure that the world understood exactly what was being done to one of the most important inventions in human history, the internet, and to make sure that they knew that the government was doing exactly that which it was trying to hide. And we understood that it was very important to realize and to accept from the start that all of us were going to be attacked if we did this. And that instead of being frightened by or deterred by threats that these governments were going to make, or calls for our imprisonment, or the invasion of our newsrooms, or the detention of our partners, and all of the other things that the US and the British government and their allies in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have tried to do to prevent the story, that instead we were going to view those threats as a testament to the fact that we were doing our job as journalists. And that if you do your job as journalists, if you don't just say that you want to challenge those who wield the greatest power, but you actually do so, that the inevitable cost of doing that is that they will try and attack you and frighten you and scare you. And it was very important that we all together, not just the three of us in Hong Kong, but our fellow journalists and editors at The Guardian and here in Germany at Der Spiegel and around the world, decided that we would view those threats as a badge of honor. And that is why I'm so honored to receive an award that is designed to commemorate journalists from many, many years ago who did the same thing, who viewed threats from the monarch and ultimately their own imprisonment as evidence that they were performing the noblest act of journalism, which is to inform their fellow citizens of that which the great people who wield the greatest power are trying to hide. Now, one of the things that usually is thought about whenever people think about this system of electronic surveillance that we have revealed is what a grave threat it poses to privacy. That's something that the Vice Chancellor has talked about and other people as well. And it certainly is true that that is a very big part of the story. But I actually think that the bigger part of the story is not the threat posed to privacy by the system of surveillance, but the threat that is posed to democracy. People often ask me, if I do media interviews anywhere in the world, people will always ask me, what is the single most shocking revelation that you think you have discovered? What is the thing that shocked you the most in these documents? And what I always say is, what shocked me the most is that it is the explicit goal of the US and the UK and their surveillance partners to collect the entire internet and all electronic communications. Their motto, their phrase that they use to describe their own purpose is collect it all. Not collect some of it, or collect lots of it, or collect all of the communications of terrorists, but to collect all of it. All human communication that takes place on the internet and in other forms electronically, which is another way of saying that their explicit goal is the elimination of individual privacy in the digital age. That is not hyperbole, that is not an exaggeration, that is not science fiction. That is, as their own documents that we have published state clearly, the actual institutional goal of these countries. And it's a goal that they're very close to achieving. They collect billions of communication events by and between human beings on this planet every single day. And their greatest challenge is how to figure out how to store all of it, even though enormous amounts of data can be stored on tiny little thumb drives. They are building massive new facilities in Great Britain, in the United States, and in elsewhere simply to store all of the data that they're collecting and then control through. And what shocked me the most about discovering that was not actually the threat that it poses to privacy, but the fact that all of this has been done in complete secrecy, without a shred of debate in these countries that call themselves democracies. Here you have one of the most consequential policies a government can adopt to convert the internet from what has always been heralded as being, which is this tool of liberalization and democratization, and convert it, degrade it, into this unprecedented tool of monitoring and coercion and control. And you may be somebody who thinks that that's a good idea. The Vice Chancellor talked about the threat posed by terrorism and rejected the idea that that threat is exaggerated by Western governments. I certainly disagree, but you can have a meaningful debate about the true threat of terrorism, about the steps that ought to be taken. But you can't have that debate democratically if all of this information is concealed. In almost every country where we did reporting, I had members of parliaments who sat on the very committees designed to oversee these agencies, who have said privately but also publicly, I knew almost nothing about what these agencies are doing until I read about them in the newspapers as a result of your reporting. Not just the citizenry and not just politicians, but the very elected officials who are supposed to exercise oversight of these agencies had very little idea of what they were actually intending to do. Just this week, there was a report issued by the British Parliament that concluded that a fundamental overhaul of the legal framework in Great Britain is needed to govern surveillance. And one of the things the report said on several occasions is these members of Parliament who were investigating the GCHQ said, we read in newspapers that the agency was doing this. One of the most fascinating documents that I found in the Snowden archive, and that I ended up publishing, was a series of magazines that the NSA produces for itself. It's a top secret magazine, and they circulate it internally. And like any magazine that you can go buy on the newsstands, the magazine has interviews, little friendly interviews with various NSA officials. And there was one particular issue from 2012 that had an interview with the NSA official who was responsible for overseeing the foreign partnerships that the NSA has with various intelligence agencies around the world, including here in Germany. And the interviewer asked this official, he said, one of the things that's difficult to understand is that you have in these countries all kinds of elections where different parties win, the government and the power shifts from the right to the left and back to the right again. And yet, even with all these changes in governments, it almost never happens that the relationship that the NSA has to these intelligence agencies changes in any way. It just continues year after year, decade after decade, huge amounts of technology sharing, huge amounts of information sharing. The interviewer said, why is that? Why, when you have all of these election changes, don't these relationships change? And what this official said is, he said, the reason they don't change is because very few people outside of the military and intelligence structure even know that these partnerships exist. Meaning, even your highest elected officials and the elected officials of other Western democracies are excluded from any real knowledge of what these agencies have been doing. At least they were until Edward Snowden allowed us to learn about them. 60 years ago, a US president named Dwight Eisenhower, who was a general his entire life, he led the Allied armed forces to victory in World War II and then served as president for 8 years. On the day that he left office in 1961, he gave a speech to the American public that was intended to be his farewell address. And he had 5 minutes to tell Americans what he thought they should hear. And he chose to issue a warning. And the warning he issued was about what he called the military-industrial complex. This union of military and corporate power that had grown so secretive and so significant that it was even more powerful than him, than the highest elected official in the United States. And he warned that if that trend continues, it would actually threaten democracy. That was 60 years ago, before the Vietnam War, before decades of the Cold War, and especially before Western governments around the world used the attack of September 11th and the threat of terrorism to justify enormous amounts of secrecy previously unknown to Western democracy, so that now most of what our governments do of the greatest significance are done completely in the dark. You can call your country a democracy. You can go every 2 years or 4 years or 6 years and check a box next to a name or a party that you think should wield power. But if you're doing that in ignorance of what those political officials are doing, it's really an illusory or a symbolic process more than it is a meaningful exercise of democracy. And much more than a desire to protect privacy, it was this desire to protect democracy that led Edward Snowden to come forward and reveal these secrets and drove us to do the journalism that we were doing. Now, one of the dangers of traveling, as much as I do, I travel to different countries continuously, is that you can actually lose sight of, you can actually forget where you are physically in the world, what country you're actually in. And thanks to the presence of so many government and political officials here today, and particularly the Vice Chancellor, there is no risk that I will become confused and think that I'm actually in the United States or Great Britain. Because in those countries, virtually no political official would get anywhere near an event like this. They will... They'll express support privately using encryption and top secret means of communication, but very few of them will actually be willing to stand up and publicly in those countries and praise Edward Snowden or the journalism that we've been able to do. So thank you very much to all of the officials who are here today for recognizing that vibrant journalism is not a threat to democracy, but actually is crucial to preserving it and strengthening it. So I want to talk a little bit about privacy, although I said that the threat posed to democracy, I think, is the bigger story. Obviously, the threat posed to privacy is an enormous part of the debate that has been triggered. And there are lots of reasons why a threat to privacy is so damaging. Nobody who lives in this country needs anybody to explain why it is that having mass surveillance can be so threatening to basic political rights. My own country, the United States, has its own very long and very ugly history for decades under presidents from both political parties of having the government misuse its surveillance practices by telling the public that it's being done for public safety, but in fact targeting political opponents and dissidents and all sorts of other people. Governments and people who wield political power always justify what they do by claiming that it's being done to protect the citizenry against threats. But usually what they mean by threats is much different than what you might mean. If you think about people who pose a threat, you probably think about people who are planning to blow up buildings or to kill innocent people for a political cause. But people who come to wield political power typically start to view what is a threat in a much, much broader way. It typically ends up meaning anybody who poses a challenge to the exercise of our power or to our political will. Which is why, on a political level, mass surveillance is so dangerous, and that has proven to be the case historically. Now, one of the most common sentiments that you hear when people try to claim that privacy isn't really that important, and I'm sure you've all heard it, everybody in this room, many times, maybe some of you even say it, is, well, I don't actually think privacy is really that important because I don't do anything wrong, and therefore I wouldn't really mind if the BND or the government or other agencies around the world read what I do. I'm a pretty boring, uninteresting, unthreatening person, and I really don't mind if they go ahead and read it. Now, everybody who says that, it's very easy to say it, but everybody who says it doesn't actually mean that. They don't really believe it. And the way that I know that nobody really believes it is that everybody takes all kinds of steps to protect their own privacy. We all have things to hide. We all put passwords on our email and social media accounts. We put locks on our bedroom and our bathroom doors. Every every single time somebody has said to me, I really don't care if my privacy is being violated because I'm doing nothing wrong and I have nothing to hide, I always say the same thing, which is I get out a pen and I write down my email address and I say, here's my email address. When you get home, I want you to email to me all of the passwords to your email and social media accounts. Not just the respectable ones in your name, but all the ones that you use, so that I can just troll through it at will and publish whatever I find interesting. And to this day, essentially, almost without exception, nobody has taken me up on that offer. That email location is a very, very desolate place. And if you look at the leaders of technology companies like Facebook and Google, who have tried to tell the world that privacy no longer really matters, if you look at how they live their own lives, you see that they don't believe that at all. They take all kinds of steps to prevent people from knowing what it is that they're doing and saying. There's actually an article today in the New York Times about how tech companies the leaders of tech companies have taken all sorts of steps to prevent people from learning what they do in their homes or seeing what it is that they do in their personal and private lives. And there's a good reason for that. And the reason is that we all understand that privacy is crucial, that having a place that we can go where we can think and explore and test the limits of dissent is a vital part of what it means to be a free individual. There are all kinds of social science studies that show that human beings who believe they're being watched take many choices that are much more conformist and obedient in nature. The state of being watched, or thinking that you might be being watched, already harms who you are and the kinds of choices that are available to you. It really is in the private realm where things like creativity and dissent and human individuality exclusively reside. And it's why a society in which that's eliminated is such a profound threat to human freedom. Now, I just want to end by talking a little bit about the person who you just saw on video, Edward Snowden, and I just want to make a couple of points about him. And the first point I want to make is one that I actually made directly to the Vice Chancellor prior to his leaving, and it's one that I was hoping to make while I stood here, but one that I will make again to him directly since he gave me a way to contact him. But not just him, but lots of other officials inside of Germany. There have been a lot of really inspiring things that have happened as a result of the Edward Snowden disclosures. An incredibly significant debate around the world. I live in Brazil, where this story was one of the leading stories over the last 2 years. People have debated the value of digital privacy for the first time, the threat posed by government secrecy, the role of journalism. But one of the really disappointing things that has happened is that the countries and governments that have benefited the most by the sacrifice that Edward Snowden has made are the same countries and the same governments that have very disgracefully turned their back on him at his greatest time of need. And what I find remarkable is that the government of this country and the government of several other countries has benefited greatly from what it is that he did. The Chancellor of this country learned about the way in which our own private communications has been targeted. The institutions of this country learned about vulnerabilities to their own communication security of which they were previously unaware. The population of this country learned that it is subjected to and targeted with programs of mass surveillance, all of which this country learned about as a result of the sacrifice made by Edward Snowden and the risks that he took to his own life and to his own. At the same time, the government of this country and the governments of other countries has refused to do for Edward Snowden what he did for them, which is take small risks in order to protect his political rights the way that he took risks to protect their political rights, and has instead, and I think history will view this very shamefully, left it to left it to a tiny band of powerless countries in Latin America and Vladimir Putin's Russia to do what those governments should be doing and have the legal, moral, and ethical obligation to do, which is offer asylum to Edward Snowden. Was asked about this, his answer was, well, if Edward Snowden were to come here, we would have to deport him to the United States. But that's actually not the case. Asylum is a widely recognized principle under international law. Countries offer asylum to people who are being threatened by their own governments all the time. And if the government of Germany, and if the government of France, and the government of Brazil, and Spain, and Italy, and India were to offer asylum to Edward Snowden, that would send an important message to the world and to future whistleblowers that the world that preaches about democracy and freedom and transparency will not stand by when someone comes forward and has their government threaten them with life in prison. I think it's very easy to dole out lectures to the rest of the world about a free press and democracy and to claim that you believe in it. But if you allow the people who come forward to journalists to be threatened with life in prison for doing so, I think those words ring very hollow. One last point, and it's about Edward Snowden as well. And it's about the lessons that I think we can draw from his example. And it's actually the same lesson that we can draw from the example of Siebenpfeifer and a whole variety of other people throughout history who have engaged in personal risk in pursuit of some justice. When Laura and I went to Hong Kong to meet Edward Snowden, we had no idea who it was we had been communicating with. We knew nothing about him. His name, where he worked, and his age, nothing. And the first thing that struck us was how young he was. He was 29 years old, but he looked probably 5 years younger. He looked like a kid that you see at a mall. And the more I got to know Edward Snowden, what struck me the most about him was how ordinary he was. He grew up in a lower middle class environment. He didn't even finish high school. He had no family power or connection or position or prestige. And yet through nothing more than an act of conscience, he literally changed the world. He changed the world. He changed how hundreds of millions of people think about a whole range of issues. And if you look at how political change often occurs, it's typically the people who are least powerful and most ordinary who bring about the greatest change. Whether it's Rosa Parks, who, by refusing to sit at the back of a bus one day, helped spark the civil rights movement in the United States, or a Tunisian street vendor who set himself on fire and sparked an Arab Spring that threatened the greatest tyrannies on the planet. It's often the case that ordinary people bring about that kind of change. And it's often the case that when we think about injustices, we like to tell ourselves, well, there's nothing we can really do about these things. We're not very powerful. We are faced with these great adversaries. I can protest injustice, but I ultimately can't do much to change it. And for me, the lesson of Edward Snowden, the thing that has affected me the most and will affect me the most for the rest of my life, is what it shows is that any human institution that is built by human beings, no matter how formidable it may seem, can be undermined or modified or torn down and replaced by other human beings whenever there's the necessary courage and the necessary will. And for me, that can only happen if we have the information that we need to have to make ourselves aware of what is being done in the world. And that's why freedom of the press is such a viable and crucial value, and it's why I'm really honored to receive an award like this designed to protect it. Thank you very much again. Appreciate it.